The sky over Dry Creek had the weary hue of ashes scattered across pale embers, a gray that seemed too tired to hold the light. Evening pressed itself gently into the bones of the small town, and in that hour when work should have been giving way to rest, a figure came staggering down the dirt road, half hidden in dust. Clara May's steps were uneven, her breath shallow, her dress torn along the seams where rough hands had pulled too hard. Her hair, once chestnut-rich, now hung matted against her shoulders, damp with sweat and streaked with blood. There was no cry left in her throat, no plea beyond the whisper that slipped past her lips like something broken. "Just make it quick!" The words fell not into empty air, but into the silence of a man who had been watching the road from the porch of the Mercantile's shadow. Jedediah Kane did not speak often, and when he did, his voice was the sort that felt carved out of stone, too heavy to waste. A cowboy by trade and loner by habit, his reputation was built not on glory but on absence. Absence of laughter, absence of close kin, absence of anger even when provoked. Yet when Clara stumbled, her body bowing as though the weight of shame pressed harder than her wounds, Jedediah stepped forward before thought could stop him. Her eyes caught his, and he saw in them not only pain but a strange kind of surrender. The words she had spoken, just make it quick, did not belong to someone who sought rescue. They belonged to someone who had given up hope that rescue could ever come. The town had turned from her already, that much was clear. In the corners of the street, whispers curled like smoke. She asked for it. She was trouble from the start. No decent woman ends up alone like that unless she deserves it. Gossip was a sharper lash than any whip, and Clara bore both. Jedediah reached for her, not roughly, not in haste, but with the steadiness of a man accustomed to taming skittish horses. He placed his hand near her shoulder without touching, a gesture both offering and asking. She did not flinch, though every bruise on her arms spoke of men who had not hesitated to strike. For a moment she studied him, as though trying to measure whether he meant harm or mercy. Then, with the last of her strength, she leaned ever so slightly toward him. That was enough. He lifted her as one lifts something already fragile, and the crowd of onlookers pretended not to see, though their eyes followed. He did not take her to the doctor. The doctor's wife was known for a tongue sharper than her husband's scalpel, and Clara would find no gentleness there. He did not lead her to the saloon either. Drink and laughter would gnaw her bones raw. Instead, Jedediah carried her through the twilight to the edge of his ranch, where an old barn leaned against the prairie wind. The barn smelled of hay, horses, and would smoke faint from the cabin nearby. Fireflies darted through cracks in the boards, their glow soft as if even they wished to hush the night. Inside, he laid her on a pile of clean hay, then lit a lantern whose golden light washed across her torn dress. The sight of her wounds stilled him, cruel welts carved across her back, bruises blotched along her ribs, lips split as though silenced by fists. He retrieved water and cloth, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. When he pressed the damp cloth to her skin, she hissed, her breath catching. "Don't," she whispered. But her voice carried no strength, only the reflex of someone too used to pain. Jedediah did not answer. He continued, gentler, as though each stroke of the cloth might erase not just blood but memory. Clara studied his face while he worked. It was weathered, lines cut deep from sun and silence, his jaw set with restraint rather than hardness. He looked at her wounds without pity, only a quiet recognition that told her he had known hurt himself. She wondered who had carved those shadows into his gaze, what ghosts he carried in the hollows of his silence. The thought that she was not the only one marked by cruelty startled her, and for the first time in many days, she did not feel entirely alone. When at last the bleeding slowed and her breathing eased, Jedediah spoke. The words were low, gravel in the throat, but clear enough to strike her heart. "They'll pay for this." It was not said with the heat of vengeance, but with the weight of a promise. Clara's lips parted, though no reply came. She had no faith left in promises. Yet something in the way he said it, quiet, unshaken, felt different. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but because exhaustion pressed her down into the hay. Outside, the sound of distant laughter drifted from the saloon, shrill and merciless, the kind of laughter that thrived on another's downfall. Clara's face tightened, for she knew they laughed at her. Jedediah stood by the barn door, watching the horizon where night pressed against earth. His hand rested on the wooden frame, rough-knuckled, steady. He had been called many things: coward for refusing to draw his gun when insulted, fool for living alone rather than joining a crew, ghost for how little he spoke. But in this moment, he felt none of those names fit. He felt only the certainty that if he turned his back now, he would be betraying not just Clara, but himself. The lantern burned low, its flame small but persistent. Clara shifted, her breath softening into uneasy sleep, the corners of her mouth twitching as though she dreamed of voices she could not silence. Jedediah watched her with an ache deeper than desire, a recognition of someone standing on the same edge of ruin where he had once stood. His chest rose and fell with a silent vow he could not name, save for the words already spoken. "They'll pay for this," he whispered again, softer this time, as though telling it to himself. His voice carried no boast, only the kind of resolve that settles in a man who has nothing left to lose. The barn door stood half open, letting in a stream of moonlight that cut across the floor in silver lines. Dust motes drifted through the beam, weightless, suspended between earth and sky. The world outside would not change overnight. The town would still whisper, the men who hurt her would still swagger. But here, in this fragile space between brokenness and healing, something had shifted. Clara was no longer unseen. Jedediah was no longer unmoved. The night held them both, two souls marked by silence yet tethered by defiance. And though neither could name it yet, the first thread of survival had been tied between them, fine as spider silk, strong enough to hold until dawn. Morning crept slowly across the plains, its pale light spilling into the barn and softening the sharp edges of night. Clara stirred against the hay, the scent of smoke and leather mingling with the faint sweetness of alfalfa. Her body ached, but for the first time in days she did not wake to terror. Instead, she found Jedediah seated near the door, a tin cup of coffee balanced in his hand, his hat tilted low to hide his eyes. He had not left her through the night. The realization unsettled her as much as it steadied her. No one had ever stayed. She pushed herself upright, her bruised arms trembling with effort. Jedediah noticed and placed the cup near her without a word. The warmth of it seeped into her palms, anchoring her in a world she had nearly abandoned. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too thin against the weight of what he had given. Instead, she whispered, "You shouldn't have done this. They'll come." Her voice cracked, carrying both warning and resignation. Jedediah's head lifted, his eyes steady, calm as still water. "Let them," he said, the words plain but iron-bound. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, but Clara felt the net of gossip tightening even from within these walls. Dry Creek was small, and cruelty traveled fast. She knew the whispers by heart, the way women at the well turned their shoulders, the way men smirked as if shame itself were entertainment. Jedediah's silence, however, created a space where none of that could reach. She could not decide if it was foolishness or courage, but she felt herself breathing easier within it. Days unfolded quietly, measured by the chores Jedediah never neglected. Clara watched him mend a fence, feed his horses, grind coffee beans by hand. Each task was deliberate, unhurried, yet carried a strength that did not need to announce itself. When he placed work before her, a broom for sweeping the barn floor, a pan of beans to stir over the fire, she accepted with reluctance at first, then with a growing sense of dignity. These were not commands but invitations, subtle ways of telling her she still had purpose. She began to hum while she worked, soft fragments of songs her mother had once sung when the world was gentler. Jedediah never interrupted, never asked for more. His silence was not emptiness but shelter. Each evening, as the lantern cast its glow across the wooden beams, Clara felt the shame of her wounds loosening, thread by painful thread. Yet shadows lingered at the edges of their fragile peace. Men rode past the ranch, eyes sharp, voices carrying in the wind. The foreman whose advances she had refused was not one to forgive insult. She remembered his sneer, the sting of his hand, the way others had laughed instead of stopping him. Fear pricked at her, but when she looked at Jedediah sharpening his knife or checking the chamber of his rifle, she sensed not a thirst for violence but a steady readiness. He did not posture. He prepared. The test came sooner than either of them wished. One evening, when the sky burned with the colors of a dying sun, Clara walked into town beside Jedediah. She wore a shawl pulled close, her head held higher than before, though her heart hammered with every step. The mercantile door creaked as they entered, conversation halting for a beat too long. Whispers fluttered like crows in the rafters. Asterisk, there she is. Look at her, bold as brass. And him, silent fool, thinks he's her protector. Asterisk, Clara felt the weight of every eye, but Jedediah's presence steadied her stride. It was outside the mercantile, beneath the sign that swayed in the breeze, that the foreman and his men stepped forward. Their boots scuffed the dirt with practiced menace. Thought you'd hide behind a mute coward? The foreman sneered, his lip curling with disdain. Clara froze, her body remembering the blows even as her spirit screamed not to falter. Jedediah moved between them with unhurried steps, his shadow falling long in the amber light. He said nothing at first, only stood so close that the foreman's bravado quivered. When the man reached toward Clara, perhaps to seize her arm as he had before, Jedediah's hand shot out. He gripped the foreman's wrist with quiet precision, strong enough to halt, not enough to break. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. The foreman's knife glinted, half drawn, but Jedediah's voice cut sharper than any blade. "Touch her again," he said, slow and certain, "and you'll answer to me, and to every man who ever thought silence was weakness." The words carried like thunder rolling low across the plains. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Clara's heart pounded in her ears. The foreman's smirk faltered, his eyes flicking to the faces of townsfolk who watched with uncommon attention. They saw not the humiliated woman nor the quiet drifter, but something shifting, a weight of dignity settling where scorn had once thrived. The foreman pulled back, his men restless, uncertain. What power lay in Jedediah's calm unsettled them more than fists or gunfire could have. Clara, trembling yet resolute, stepped forward. Her voice wavered but carried more strength than she knew she possessed. "You don't own me." The words struck harder than any blow. Murmurs rose among the crowd, the tide of judgment beginning, at last, to turn. Shame slid from Clara's shoulders and fastened itself instead to those who had mocked and injured her. The foreman spat in the dirt but said no more. He turned, his men following with stiff shoulders, their retreat not victory but defeat cloaked in silence. Clara watched them go, her breath ragged, her body weak, yet something inside her had straightened like a tree bracing against wind. Jedediah placed a hand near her back, not quite touching, guiding her away from the crowd. Their steps fell in rhythm, slow but certain. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for the reason behind his defiance. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice raw. His gaze met hers, unflinching. "Because I once wished someone would do the same for me." The words lingered between them as they walked toward the fading horizon. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not of grief but of something she could not name, something like belonging. The town watched them leave, not with jeers this time but with a silence tinged with respect. It was not absolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. As night spread its velvet cloak, Clara felt lighter, as though each step shed a fragment of the shame that had bound her. The barn awaited them with its quiet refuge, but now it held more than safety. It held the seed of dignity reclaimed, a strength shared between two wounded souls who had found, in each other, the courage to stand again. And to those who might have been watching from afar, the lesson whispered clear: scars did not define worth, silence was not weakness, and even in a place as harsh as the Wild West, grace could bloom like a wildflower in dust, stubborn, radiant, and alive.